Your sister has had 7 jobs in 3 years. Those words crashed through the backyard party like a wrecking ball through glass. Dad stood there with his wine glass raised, 50 guests hanging on every syllable, and instead of celebrating 30 years of marriage, he decided to destroy me publicly. Everyone stared at me with that familiar look of disappointment I knew so well. My perfect sister Amanda smiled smugly from the head table, her engagement ring catching the string lights we had hung that afternoon. Dad continued without mercy. He can't even keep a job. The crowd murmured their disapproval while I sat there, feeling that old familiar sting of being the family disappointment. But tonight was going to be different. Tonight, everything would change forever. I had arrived 3 hours earlier with such hope in my chest. After months of planning this anniversary celebration, I genuinely believed this night might finally bring our fractured family together. The September evening air carried the scent of Mom's favorite roses, and I had personally arranged for the backyard to be transformed into something magical. White tablecloths covered 6 round tables, each centerpiece featuring 30 white candles representing each year of their marriage. The catering truck from Riverside Manor had delivered enough food for an army, and the string lights I had insisted on created a warm golden glow across the entire space. Growing up, I was always the dreamer, while Amanda was the achiever. She excelled at everything from piano recitals to academic competitions, while I spent my time sketching business plans in notebook margins and reading entrepreneurship books under my bedroom flashlight. Dad owned Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized construction firm that had been the backbone of our family for 2 decades. Every dinner conversation revolved around building permits, contractor disputes, and profit margins. When I showed interest in business, Dad would laugh and ruffle my hair. "Son, you need to learn how to hammer a nail before you can run a company." But Dad's company had been struggling for the past 2 years. Rising material costs, labor shortages, and increased competition from larger firms had slowly chipped away at his client base. I noticed the worry lines deepening around his eyes during family dinners, the way he would stare at his coffee cup when discussing upcoming projects. Mom had started clipping coupons again, something she hadn't done since my elementary school years. 6 months ago, I moved back to town after being away for 5 years. When family asked about my work, I simply said I was in consulting. The truth was far more complicated, but I wasn't ready to deal with their reaction. Every Sunday dinner became an interrogation about my career prospects, with Dad making subtle digs about responsibility and Amanda offering helpful suggestions about entry-level positions at the hospital where she worked. The guest list tonight included Dad's business partners, Mom's entire book club, aunts and uncles I hadn't seen since last Christmas, and family friends who had watched me grow up. Mrs. Henderson from next door kept asking when I was going to settle down like Amanda. Cousin Jake wondered aloud if I was ever going to buy a house. Uncle Robert, Dad's younger brother, spent 20 minutes explaining how I needed to think seriously about my future before it was too late. As I watched Dad mingle with his guests, I could see the strain behind his forced smile. Frank Sullivan, his longtime business partner, stood near the dessert table looking equally uncomfortable. They kept glancing toward each other with expressions I recognized as barely contained panic. Something major was happening with the business, something they weren't sharing with the family. Throughout the evening, I wrestled with whether to finally tell them the truth about my success. Part of me wanted to end the constant humiliation, but another part feared they would only value me for my money rather than accepting me as I was. The internal struggle felt like carrying a boulder up a mountain, exhausting and seemingly endless. Then Amanda suddenly rose from her chair, champagne flute in hand, commanding attention from every guest. The conversations died mid-sentence as she cleared her throat dramatically. "I have wonderful news to share on this special evening," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard with practiced confidence. "Bradley and I are getting engaged." She extended her left hand, revealing a diamond ring that could probably fund a small business startup. The collective gasp from the crowd was followed by enthusiastic applause. Dad's face transformed completely. His worry lines disappeared as pure joy replaced the stress he had been carrying. Finally, he beamed, wrapping Amanda in a bear hug that lifted her off the ground. Someone in this family makes me proud. The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable confirming what I had always suspected. No matter what I accomplished, I would never measure up to Amanda in his eyes. Amanda basked in the congratulations like a sunflower turning toward light. Guests surrounded her table, admiring the engagement ring and asking about wedding plans. She deliberately avoided making eye contact with me, her attention focused entirely on the adoring crowd gathered around her chair. Every compliment seemed to inflate her confidence while simultaneously deflating my sense of belonging at this celebration. Last Christmas flashed through my memory with painful clarity. Amanda had cornered Mom in the kitchen while I was supposedly napping on the living room couch. She whispered just loud enough for me to overhear, "Irvin is still figuring himself out at 28. Mom, don't you think it's time he grew up and took some responsibility?" Mom had defended me half-heartedly, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice when she said, "He's always been a late bloomer, honey." Uncle Robert approached me with that expression adults reserve for lost causes. His calloused hand landed on my shoulder with the weight of pity. "Don't worry about it, son," he said, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness people use when delivering bad news. "We all bloom at different times. Some folks just need extra seasons to find their way." His words were meant as comfort, but they felt like confirmation that everyone saw me as the family project, the one who needed fixing. Cousin Jake materialized beside me with a beer in his hand and mischief in his eyes. "Dude," he whispered conspiratorially, "when are you actually going to get your life together? I mean, Amanda's getting married to a neurosurgeon, and you're still doing whatever it is you do." His laugh carried no malice, just genuine curiosity mixed with second-hand embarrassment. Frank Sullivan, Dad's business partner for over 15 years, wandered over during Amanda's engagement story. His weathered face showed the strain of whatever crisis they were facing at Morrison and Associates. Frank mentioned casually that the company was going through changes, but his eyes darted nervously toward Dad whenever he spoke. The way he emphasized changes made it clear he meant something far more serious than typical business adjustments. I excused myself to refill my water glass and caught fragments of conversation that made my stomach clench. Mom was near the beverage station, apologizing to the neighbors for my apparent lack of direction. "Irvin's just taking some time to find his path," she explained, with that apologetic tone parents use when discussing disappointing children. "He's always been creative, just needs to channel it properly." Her words stung because they revealed how little she understood about my actual situation. Meanwhile, Amanda's fiancé Bradley held court near the main table, discussing his neurosurgery practice with the captivated audience. He described complex procedures with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Guests hung on every word as he explained the intricacies of brain surgery, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that clearly communicated their thoughts about our vastly different levels of achievement. Dad's forced smile became more pronounced as the evening progressed. When guests asked about his business, he deflected with vague statements about exciting opportunities and market challenges. His hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was watching, and I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly throughout the dinner service. The contrast between Amanda's triumph and my perceived failure felt suffocating. Every congratulation directed toward her seemed to highlight my absence of similar accomplishments, at least from their perspective. The evening that was supposed to celebrate my parents' marriage had somehow transformed into a showcase of Amanda's superiority and my inadequacy. I needed a moment to collect myself, so I headed toward the house under the pretense of using the bathroom. The sliding glass door provided temporary refuge from the overwhelming display of disappointment and judgment happening in the backyard. But as I approached the hallway, I heard voices coming from Dad's home office. The door was slightly ajar, and Frank Sullivan's unmistakable voice carried through the opening. I froze when I realized they were having a private conversation about the business. Frank's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke words that made my blood run cold. "Jim, you can't keep pretending everything is fine. The acquisition fell through completely. These new owners are demanding massive layoffs, and you know what that means for the pension fund." Then I heard something that shattered my heart into pieces. Dad was crying. This man, who had always been the picture of strength and control, was sobbing like a broken child. "I don't know how I'm going to tell Sarah about the house," he whispered to Frank. 30 years of marriage, and I'm going to lose everything we built together. The kids don't know how bad things really are, and now, with Amanda's wedding coming up, I can't burden them with this mess. Frank's response was barely audible, but I caught enough words to understand the full scope of their crisis. The company was essentially bankrupt. Dad's personal assets were tied up as collateral for loans that couldn't be repaid, and the family home was at risk of foreclosure within 60 days. Everything I thought I understood about our family's financial situation was completely wrong. Returning to the party felt like walking into an alternate reality where everyone was performing happiness while tragedy lurked beneath the surface. Dad had rejoined the guests with renewed determination to maintain his facade, but now I could see through his performance. Every laugh seemed forced, every smile appeared painted on, and his eyes carried the hollow look of a man facing complete ruin. Amanda was still surrounded by admirers, but something about her behavior had shifted since my brief absence. Her phone buzzed constantly against the table, and she kept glancing at the screen with increasing agitation. The confident bride-to-be from earlier was showing cracks in her perfect exterior. When someone asked about her wedding timeline, she provided vague answers and quickly changed the subject. I decided to check on our teenage cousin Sarah, who had been sitting quietly at the kids' table looking overwhelmed by the adult conversations. But as I approached, I discovered Amanda cornering the poor girl near the garden gate. Amanda's voice carried a sharp edge that contrasted sharply with the sweet tone she used with the other guests. "Sarah, you need to understand something important about making smart choices in life," Amanda was saying, her finger pointing accusingly. "You don't want to end up like Uncle Irvin, drifting through your 20s without any real purpose or direction. Look around this party and see who gets respect and who gets pity. That should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of person you want to become." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment as she nodded silently. The poor kid was only 16 and shouldn't have been subjected to Amanda's lecture disguised as life advice. But Amanda continued her inappropriate monologue, completely oblivious to how cruel her words sounded. Mom approached me during Amanda's speech with that concerned expression mothers reserve for their most problematic children. "Honey," she said quietly, pulling me aside near the rose bushes. "I've been thinking about your situation. Do you need help with rent this month? I know a few people who might be willing to put in a good word for you at some local companies. There's no shame in accepting assistance when you're struggling to get established." Her offer came from genuine love, but it reinforced just how completely my family misunderstood my actual circumstances. They saw someone who needed saving rather than someone who had already succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The irony felt crushing, especially knowing what I had just overheard about Dad's financial crisis. Dad chose that moment to call for everyone's attention again. He climbed onto a garden chair, wine glass raised high, and announced that he had exciting business news to share with the family. But when Uncle Robert asked for specific details, Dad deflected with corporate buzzwords and meaningless phrases. The exciting news seemed to evaporate under even the slightest scrutiny, leaving him looking more desperate than confident. Bradley, Amanda's neurosurgeon fiancé, made several condescending remarks throughout the evening that revealed his true character. When discussing career paths with some younger cousins, he emphasized how some people lack the intelligence and drive necessary for demanding professions. His eyes found mine during these comments, making it clear he considered me an example of wasted potential. The anxiety medication incident happened when Amanda thought everyone was distracted by Dad's business announcement. I noticed her slipping away toward the garden shed behind Mom's prized rose collection. Curiosity compelled me to follow at a discreet distance, wondering why she would disappear during her own engagement celebration. Behind the wooden shed, Amanda was frantically shaking pills from a prescription bottle into her palm. Her hands trembled as she swallowed what appeared to be more medication than any normal dose would require. When she noticed my presence, her face went completely white with terror. Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor, chose that unfortunate moment to join our family gathering. She had been chatting with other guests when she mentioned something that made my suspicions crystallize into certainty. "You know," she said to Mom while I listened from nearby. "I heard through the hospital grapevine that Amanda was let go from her position in the cardiac unit last month. Something about policy violations, though nobody wants to discuss the details." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Amanda's 7 jobs in 3 years weren't career advancement opportunities as she had claimed. They were terminations, each one probably related to the prescription drug problem she was desperately trying to hide from everyone, especially her neurosurgeon fiancé, who would certainly understand the implications of her addiction. I followed Amanda to the garden area where she was attempting to compose herself after the medication incident. The confident woman from earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who looked terrified and exhausted. When I gently confronted her about what I had witnessed, she initially tried to maintain her facade, but the stress of maintaining lies for so long had worn her down completely. Amanda broke down into tears, admitting that she had been fired from every job due to anxiety issues that had spiraled into prescription drug dependency. Each termination had made finding the next position more difficult, and she was running out of options in the medical field. The engagement to Bradley wasn't the fairy tale romance everyone believed. Amanda confessed that she was marrying him because he represented financial security and social status, not because she loved him. She was terrified that he would discover her employment history and addiction issues, which would certainly end their relationship and leave her with nothing. "At least one of us needs to look successful," she pleaded with tears streaming down her cheeks. "If this family finds out I'm as much of a failure as you are, it will destroy Mom and Dad completely. They need to believe someone turned out right." Her words stung, but I could see the genuine fear behind her cruelty. The irony was overwhelming. Here was my perfect sister, the one who had always been held up as the example of success, begging me to keep her secrets so she could maintain the illusion that had been slowly destroying both of us. She had no idea that I had the power to solve every problem she was facing, just as she had no idea that our father was facing financial ruin that I could prevent with a single phone call. But the painful truth was that our family had created a dynamic where honesty felt impossible. We had all been performing roles for so long that revealing our authentic selves seemed like a betrayal of everyone's expectations. Amanda was trapped by her need to appear perfect. Dad was trapped by his pride and fear of appearing weak, and I was trapped by my assumption that they would only love me for my money rather than accepting me as their son and brother. Dad called everyone back for his final toast, and I could see his hands trembling as he gripped the wine glass. The confident businessman from earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like he was facing execution. Frank Sullivan stood nearby with the expression of a man watching his best friend walk toward a cliff, knowing he was powerless to stop the inevitable fall. I returned to my seat with my mind racing between Amanda's devastating confession and Dad's hidden financial crisis. The weight of secrets felt suffocating, and I realized that this anniversary party had become a perfect storm of family dysfunction disguised as celebration. Everyone was performing their assigned roles while drowning in private desperation. Dad began his speech about family values and the importance of success, but his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. He spoke about building something meaningful, about leaving a legacy worth remembering, about the pride that comes from honest work and achievement. But I could see the hypocrisy behind every word, knowing he was bankrupt and facing the loss of everything he claimed to value. Then he pivoted to what I now realized was his real purpose for this toast. "Your sister has had 7 jobs in 3 years, he announced loudly, gesturing toward me with his wine glass. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that something inappropriate was happening but unsure how to respond to such a public humiliation. Amanda's face went completely white as she processed Dad's words. In her medicated state, she thought he had discovered her employment failures and addiction issues. The look of terror in her eyes was heartbreaking, especially knowing that Dad was actually talking about me, not her. But his next words made it clear who his target really was. "He can't even keep a job," Dad continued mercilessly. "I don't know where your mother and I went wrong with this one. 28 years old and still floating from one thing to another like a leaf in the wind. No direction, no ambition. no sense of responsibility whatsoever. The silence that followed felt dense and oppressive. 50 guests sat frozen in their chairs, witnessing a father destroy his son at what should have been a celebration of love and commitment. I could feel their collective discomfort radiating across the backyard, but nobody seemed willing to intervene or redirect the conversation. This was my moment of choice. I could continue playing the role of family disappointment, allowing Dad to use my humiliation as a distraction from his own failures. I could protect Amanda's secrets and Dad's pride while sacrificing my own dignity on the altar of family dysfunction, or I could finally tell the truth and deal with whatever consequences followed. I stood up slowly, feeling calmer than I had felt in months. The decision was surprisingly easy once I stopped caring about their potential reactions and started caring about my own integrity. "Actually, Dad," I said in a voice that carried clearly across the backyard, "I've had the same job for 5 years." Dad's laugh was bitter and dismissive. "Oh, really? Where exactly? Some fast food restaurant that you're too embarrassed to mention? Maybe one of those startups that'll be bankrupt next month?" His words dripped with the accumulated resentment of a man who had been struggling while assuming his son was failing even more spectacularly. I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness, giving myself time to consider the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. The business card I displayed showed my name and title in clean professional lettering. Irvin Morrison, Chief Executive Officer, Nexcore Industries. The company logo was unmistakable to anyone who followed business news, and I watched Dad's expression change from confusion to recognition to absolute horror. "You know," I continued calmly, "the company that acquired your firm last month." My voice remained steady despite the earthquake I could feel building in my chest. The room fell completely silent as the implications of my words sank into the consciousness of 50 shocked guests. Frank Sullivan's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the patio stones with a sound that seemed to echo for minutes. Dad's face went through a series of transformations, from disbelief to comprehension to something that looked like physical illness. The man who had been publicly humiliating me seconds earlier now looked like he might collapse. Uncle Robert's mouth fell open as he processed what I had just revealed. Cousin Jake pulled out his phone and started typing frantically, probably Googling Nexcore Industries to confirm what he had just heard. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her chair, straining to hear every word of what was clearly the most dramatic moment this family had ever experienced. Mom's hand flew to her throat as she whispered, "Irvin, what are you saying?" Her voice carried a mixture of confusion, hope, and terror, as if she couldn't decide whether to be proud or horrified by this revelation. Amanda stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. The perfect sister who had been condescending to me for years suddenly realized that her failure brother was actually a millionaire who could solve every problem she was facing. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, but Dad's reaction was the most important one in that moment. This man who had spent decades telling me I wasn't good enough, who had used my apparent failures as entertainment for his anniversary guests, was now faced with the reality that I owned the company he worked for. The power dynamic he had constructed through years of emotional manipulation had just been completely reversed. Bradley, Amanda's neurosurgeon fiancé, suddenly developed an intense interest in conversation with me. The man who had been making condescending remarks about people who lacked direction was now calculating how to position himself advantageously with someone who clearly had more money and influence than he had originally assumed. The silence stretched on as Dad struggled to find words. His mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "But you said you worked in consulting." The truth was more complicated than a simple job title could convey, and I realized this moment required complete honesty rather than further misdirection. "I do consult," I replied, meeting Dad's stunned gaze directly. "I consult with companies before acquiring them." Technical accuracy seemed important when the entire foundation of our family relationship was being reconstructed in real time. Uncle Robert's voice cracked with disbelief as he asked the question everyone was thinking. "Wait a minute. You're the CEO who's been featured in Forbes magazine, the one they wrote that article about last year?" His expression shifted from pity to something approaching awe, and I could see him mentally recalculating every interaction we had ever had. Frank Sullivan stepped forward, his face pale with recognition. "Jim," he said to Dad in a voice barely above a whisper, "he's the one who's been sending those emergency funding packages, the anonymous investor who kept us afloat for the past 6 months. It was your son the entire time." The revelation hit Dad like a physical blow. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the table for support as the full scope of what Frank was saying penetrated his consciousness. The anonymous help that had prevented immediate bankruptcy, the mysterious investor who had insisted on protecting worker benefits and pension funds, the acquisition terms he had complained about as being too generous to employees. All of it had come from me. Bradley suddenly materialized beside me with an expression of calculated friendliness. "Evan," he said with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to networking with wealthy individuals, "I had no idea you were in such an impressive position. We should definitely get together soon to discuss some exciting opportunities I've been considering." The transformation in his behavior was so blatant that several guests noticed and exchanged knowing glances. This was the same man who had been making subtle insults about my lack of direction 30 minutes earlier, now positioning himself as my potential business partner. Mom demanded explanations with the authority of someone who had spent 28 years raising me. "Why the secrecy, Irvin? Why didn't you tell us the truth?" Her voice carried hurt and confusion, but I could also hear hope beginning to creep into her tone as she processed what my success might mean for our family's future. But Dad's question cut to the heart of everything. His voice shook as he asked, "Why didn't you help me directly? Why all this corporate maneuvering and anonymous investor nonsense? Why didn't you just tell me you could save the company?" The answer required me to expose the painful truth about our family dynamic, but this night had moved far beyond the possibility of diplomatic explanations. "Because, Dad," I said quietly, "you spent 28 years telling me I wasn't capable of anything meaningful. When I tried to share my business ideas as a teenager, you laughed and told me to focus on learning practical skills. When I got into business school, you said I was wasting time on theories that wouldn't work in the real world." I could see the memory recognition dawning in his eyes, the uncomfortable awareness of how many times he had dismissed my ambitions and dreams. "You created a family culture where my opinions and insights had no value," I continued. "So I built my success outside this family, and when your company got into trouble, I helped anonymously because I knew you would never accept assistance from your failure, son." Frank Sullivan confirmed what I was saying with painful honesty. "Jim," he told Dad, "every business meeting we had with NextCore representatives was actually meetings with your son's employees. The acquisition terms you complained about were designed specifically to protect your workers and preserve your pension fund. Most companies would have gutted the workforce and sold the assets, but somebody made sure that didn't happen." Amanda listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Her drug-addicted, unemployable brother was not only successful, but had been secretly protecting Dad's business and employees for months. The man she had been lecturing about life choices was in a position to solve every financial problem she was facing. If only she had been honest about her situation, instead of maintaining her facade of superiority. Uncle Robert approached with an expression of genuine remorse. "Irvin, I owe you a massive apology," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "All those comments about blooming late and finding your path, I had no idea you had already accomplished more than any of us imagined. I feel like an idiot for treating you like a charity case." Cousin Jake's reaction was more complex, mixing embarrassment with obvious calculation. "Dude," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "I've been giving you career advice while you're running a company that could buy and sell my entire industry. Do you have any idea how stupid I feel right now?" The shift in everyone's behavior was simultaneously validating and disturbing. These same people who had been treating me like a lost cause minutes earlier were now falling over themselves to acknowledge my success and reposition their relationships with me. But their motivations felt transparent and opportunistic rather than genuine. Mom pulled out a manila folder from her purse with shaking hands, and what she revealed next shocked everyone, including me. The folder contained newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and printed internet stories about Nextcore Industries and its young CEO. She had been secretly following my career for years, collecting evidence of my success while respecting my privacy about the details. "I always knew something was different about your consulting job," she said through tears, "but I respected your decision to keep the details private. I was waiting for you to trust us enough to tell the truth yourself." Her collection included the Forbes magazine cover story, several business journal articles about my company's growth, and even local newspaper mentions of charitable donations I had made anonymously. The realization that Mom had known and been proud of me all along was overwhelming. While Dad had been criticizing and Uncle Robert had been patronizing, Mom had been quietly celebrating my achievements and waiting for me to feel safe enough to share them with the family. Her patience and respect for my boundaries stood in stark contrast to everyone else's assumptions and judgments. Dad collapsed into his chair as the full weight of everything hit him simultaneously. His son owned the company that employed him, had been secretly providing the financial assistance that prevented bankruptcy, and had structured the acquisition specifically to protect Dad's workers and pension. The man he had been publicly humiliating was actually his financial savior, and the humiliation was now flowing in the opposite direction. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, but it unfolded with surprising gentleness given the explosive nature of what had just been revealed. Dad sat in his chair, looking completely defeated, not by business failure but by the recognition of how badly he had misjudged and mistreated his own son. The weight of 28 years of criticism and dismissal seemed to crash down on him all at once. Mom's demand for explanations came from a place of love rather than anger. But she needed to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from her. "Ervin," she said, sitting down across from me with that serious expression she used for important family conversations, "help me understand how this happened. When did you start your company? How long have you been successful? Why did you feel like you couldn't trust us with the truth?" The story of Nextcore Industries began when I was 23 years old, fresh out of business school and tired of being dismissed by my family as an impractical dreamer. I had identified a gap in the market for small business acquisitions and restructuring, companies that were struggling but had solid foundations that could be strengthened with proper management and investment strategies. I started with a $10,000 loan from my college fund and spent the first 2 years working 18-hour days from a studio apartment across town. The early clients were small family businesses facing bankruptcy, and I developed a reputation for saving companies while protecting worker benefits and maintaining community ties. Word spread through business networks, and within 3 years, I was handling acquisitions for much larger organizations. The secrecy developed because I was terrified that success would change how my family saw me, but not in a positive way. "I feared you would only love me for my money rather than accepting me as a person," I explained to Mom. Every family gathering became an exercise in deflecting questions while listening to criticism about my apparent lack of ambition. It seemed easier to maintain distance than risk having our relationship become transactional. Amanda's confession about her job failures and prescription drug addiction shocked the assembled guests, but it was clearly something she needed to share. The pressure of maintaining her perfect image while struggling with addiction had become unbearable, and my revelation had given her permission to stop pretending. She explained how each termination had made the next job search more difficult, and how her engagement to Bradley was motivated more by financial desperation than romantic love. Bradley's reaction to Amanda's confession was swift and predictable. The neurosurgeon who had been so eager to discuss brain surgery with admiring guests suddenly discovered urgent reasons to leave the party early. His true character emerged when faced with a fiancée who had addiction issues and employment problems, rather than the perfect medical professional he thought he was marrying. "I'm sorry, Amanda, but this changes everything," Bradley said, removing his suit jacket with the air of someone escaping a contaminated area. "I can't be associated with someone who has substance abuse issues, especially in my professional position. The medical community takes these things very seriously." His abandonment of Amanda in her moment of vulnerability revealed exactly the kind of person he really was beneath his polished exterior. But it also freed Amanda from a relationship that was based on deception and mutual exploitation rather than genuine love and support. Dad's breakdown was inevitable and necessary. This man, who had always projected strength and control, finally allowed himself to show the fear and vulnerability he had been carrying for months. "I'm sorry, Irvin," he sobbed, his voice breaking with decades of suppressed emotion. "I was so scared about losing everything that I took it out on you. My own insecurities about failing as a businessman made me criticize you for things that weren't even true." His apology opened the floodgates for everything that had been building between us for years. Dad admitted that my success in business intimidated him, even before he knew the full scope of my achievements. He had always felt threatened by my innovative ideas and different approach to problem solving, so he dismissed my contributions rather than acknowledging their value. I realized that my business degree and entrepreneurial instincts reminded him of his own limitations, Dad continued. "Instead of being proud of your abilities, I felt inadequate and tried to make you feel the same way. The criticism was never really about you. It was about my own fears of not being good enough." Uncle Robert and the other family members who had made condescending remarks throughout the evening stepped forward with their own apologies. The pattern of treating me like a charity case had been established over years of family gatherings, and it took this dramatic revelation to make them recognize how wrong their assumptions had been. Frank Sullivan provided the business context that helped Dad understand exactly how I had been helping. Every emergency loan, every favorable contract term, every protection for worker benefits had been specifically designed to save Morrison and Associates while preserving Dad's dignity. I had worked through intermediaries and corporate structures to provide assistance without making Dad feel like he was accepting charity from his son. The most surprising revelation was Mom's confession about the newspaper clippings and magazine articles. She had been tracking my career success for years, reading every article about Nexcore Industries and feeling proud of my achievements while respecting my privacy about the details. Her manila folder contained a complete record of my business accomplishments, proving that she had always believed in me even when I thought the entire family saw me as a disappointment. "I was waiting for you to trust us enough to tell the truth yourself," Mom explained through tears. "I knew you had good reasons for keeping your success private, and I didn't want to pressure you into sharing more than you were comfortable revealing. But I saved every article because I was so proud of what you had accomplished." The family dynamic that had been built on assumptions and misunderstandings was finally being dismantled through honest conversation. Dad's financial crisis could be resolved through proper business restructuring. Amanda could get help for her addiction and find meaningful work that didn't depend on maintaining impossible standards of perfection. And I could finally be accepted as a successful family member rather than a disappointing burden. But the most important transformation was Dad's recognition that his years of criticism had been misdirected expressions of his own insecurity. The man who thought he was motivating me through tough love had actually been projecting his fears onto someone who was achieving exactly the kind of success he had always wanted for himself. The healing process began immediately, but it required genuine commitment from everyone involved rather than superficial apologies and quick fixes. Dad's breakdown had cleared the air in ways that years of family therapy probably couldn't have accomplished, creating space for authentic relationships to develop between people who had been performing roles for far too long. Dad's apology extended beyond words into concrete actions that demonstrated his commitment to change. He arranged for Amanda to enter a residential treatment program that specialized in helping medical professionals overcome prescription drug addiction, and he insisted on paying for her care even though I offered to handle the financial aspects. Taking responsibility for his role in creating family pressure that contributed to Amanda's problems was his way of beginning to make amends. The business relationship between Morrison and Associates and Nexcore Industries evolved into something that balanced professional necessity with family considerations. Dad kept his position managing day-to-day operations, but he now reported to my management team rather than struggling alone with decisions that affected dozens of employees. His experience and relationships in the construction industry remained valuable, but the financial pressure that had been crushing him was transferred to corporate structures designed to handle such challenges. Amanda's recovery became a family priority that brought us closer together rather than driving us apart. She spent 60 days in treatment, followed by outpatient therapy and regular family counseling sessions that helped all of us understand how our communication patterns had contributed to her need to maintain impossible standards of perfection. When she returned, she found work as a patient advocate at a rehabilitation center, using her medical background and personal experience to help other professionals facing similar struggles. Uncle Robert and other family members who had made condescending comments throughout the evening made genuine efforts to rebuild their relationships with me based on honesty rather than assumptions. The casual cruelty that had characterized so many family gatherings gradually disappeared as everyone learned to ask questions rather than making judgments about each other's life choices and circumstances. But the most significant change was in my relationship with Dad. The man who had spent decades criticizing my ambitions became genuinely interested in learning about business strategy and innovative approaches to traditional industries. Our Sunday dinners evolved from interrogation sessions into collaborative discussions about challenges facing small businesses in changing economic environments. Dad framed my Forbes magazine cover in his office, not as a trophy representing his parenting success, but as a reminder that people's potential often exceeds our limited understanding of their capabilities. He became my strongest advocate within the family, defending my decisions and celebrating my achievements with the pride he should have shown years earlier. I established the Morrison Family Foundation, named after both Dad's company and our family legacy, focusing specifically on providing emergency assistance to struggling small businesses in our community. The foundation's mission reflected lessons learned from Dad's crisis, offering both financial support and business consulting to help family-owned companies navigate challenges without sacrificing their values or worker protections. The annual anniversary parties became celebrations of authentic connection rather than competitive displays of superficial achievement. Dad and Mom renewed their vows on their 31st anniversary, surrounded by family members who had learned to love each other despite their flaws rather than in spite of them. The toast Dad gave that evening focused on second chances, personal growth, and the importance of seeing people clearly rather than through the lens of our own expectations. Amanda met someone new during her recovery process, a social worker who admired her strength and resilience rather than her professional credentials or family background. Their relationship developed slowly and honestly, based on mutual support and genuine compatibility rather than financial considerations or social status. Her engagement ring was modest but meaningful, representing love rather than security. The transformation wasn't magical or instant, but it was genuine and lasting. Our family learned that assumptions can be more destructive than honest disagreements, that love requires seeing people as they actually are rather than as we expect them to be, and that success comes in many forms that aren't always immediately visible to outside observers. Most importantly, we discovered that authenticity creates deeper connections than performance ever could. The family that had been built on maintaining facades and meeting external expectations became a family that celebrated individual achievements while supporting each other through challenges and failures. The anniversary party that began with public humiliation ended with private revelation, but the real celebration happened in the months and years that followed as we learned to build relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. Dad's company thrived under new management structures. Amanda found meaningful work that utilized her skills without demanding perfection, and I finally felt like I belonged to a family that valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. My story proves that families can change, that success takes many forms, and that love requires courage to see past our own fears and prejudices. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we understand least, and sometimes the biggest failures in our lives are actually our greatest victories waiting to be recognized. What assumptions have you made about family members that might be preventing you from seeing their true achievements and potential? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew well was actually living a completely different reality than what you assumed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they really are, rather than who others expect them to be. Thank you for listening to my story and for taking the time to think about how assumptions and expectations can shape our relationships with the people we love most. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to hear more real-life stories about family, growth, and second chances, and share it with someone who might benefit from understanding that success isn't always visible, and that love requires the courage to see people clearly.